Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Matthew Jane, and I'm the Learning and Engagement Manager for the State Historical Society of Iowa. The Iowa History 101 webinars, presented on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month, explore Iowa's history from pre-statehood to current day. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at history.iowa.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you'd like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live, all presentations will be recorded. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker today. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in just a few days. I've disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague, Rachel Hansen, is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note we may not have time to get to all the questions. And now I'm pleased to introduce our presenter for today, Matt Walsh. Matthew Walsh is the author of The Good Governor, Robert Ray, and the Indo-Chinese Refugees of Iowa. The State Historical Society of Iowa has recognized his work with the Shambaugh and Mills Noun Awards. Walsh teaches history at Des Moines Area Community College. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Matt to begin the webinar.
Well, thanks for having me. 50 years takes us back to 1975, but I'm going to start in 1968. During the Tet Offensive, the communist forces seized the city of Hue, this very culturally rich city, and a massacre unfolded. We don't know how many died. The numbers vary, a few thousand. Some say over 7,000. Mass graves dotted the landscape. People were pulled from these graves, had been clubbed to death, others buried alive. Women, children, infants, priests were amongst the victims. So this is really on the psyche of the people just a few years later as the communists are about to take South Vietnam and Saigon is about to unfold. The term bloodbath pops up quite frequently. This was going to be a massacre on a much larger scale when the communists got their hands on Saigon. We cannot really appreciate the terror that was in the hearts and the minds of the people 50 years ago of South Vietnam. I'll give a couple of examples. When Da Nang fell, Marines witnessed people being trampled to death. A mother and her child were pushed away, and a boat came in and crushed them to death. Mothers were putting their children on pails and pushing them out to sea, hoping that Americans would take them as Da Nang was being evacuated. The Marines saw some of these youngsters fall in the water and drown. I interviewed a gentleman in Des Moines. He was a high ranking officer and politician, and he talked about when the communists were closing in on him in 1975. He walked into his children's room with a pistol and was prepared to shoot them all and then turn the weapon on himself. Better that he gave them a pain free death than to have them torture killed by the communists. So, this is the mindset at the time, sheer panic. And in this pending bloodbath, rumors circulated that not even the multiracial orphans followed by USGIs were going to be spared. Young men hooked up with Vietnamese women, they were US soldiers, and maybe these were girlfriends, bar girls, prostitutes. And from these unions, we had offspring, and people feared the communists were going to destroy even these orphans. And that brings us to the first Iowan I want to profile. Her name is Leanne Thyman. She's from the Vinton area, attended St. Mary's Church in Vinton, Iowa. And she's a 25-year-old mother of two young daughters. She moves to Iowa City. She has a nursing background. Her husband teaches speech at the University of Iowa. And she goes to a bake sale for a group called the FCVN. This is Friends of the Children of Vietnam. And they would help orchestrate adoption of Vietnamese orphans. They would do fundraisers, send food, medicine, help out the orphans, and seemed like a worthwhile mission. And from this bake sale, she gets more and more involved, becomes president of the Iowa City chapter. And in March 1975, the FCVN national headquarters is in Denver, and they asked for volunteers to bring out 6 orphans and chaperone them back to Iowa. Leanne and a woman named Carol Helder agreed to do this mission, but it was Not after some serious contemplation, Leanne is at her church in the pew crying, God, please give me a sign. I don't have to go. She did not want to go, but ultimately agreed that she would go. And before she gets to Vietnam, representatives from the FCVN asked her and Carol if they would be okay smuggling $10,000 US cash. South Vietnamese currency is basically worthless at this time. So we'll just say that Leanne arrives in Saigon looking extra busty. April 1st, 1975 is when her mission began. She's going to get 6 orphans out. She gets picked up from the airport in Saigon, and a representative from the FCVN said, Did you hear the news? President Ford has announced a baby lift. You're not bringing 6 orphans out, you're bringing 300. Wow, that really was a shock. And she goes to the orphanage that she's stationed out of in Saigon, and all these youngsters are pouring in from South Vietnam to get onto this airlift, and she witnesses one of the youngsters die, but it was understandable. That's why she was there, to help them get to loving families, better medical treatment, the attention and love that they so deserved. In my image, you can see Leanne in the back of a VW van. The center seat has been stripped out. You could fit about 22 of these orphans, and they used this van to shuttle youngsters down a narrow, basically an alleyway, to get to the larger buses, because the larger buses could not fit down their street. When Leanne was in Saigon, the communists were right on the edge of the city. She could hear artillery going off. Buildings were shaking from the vibration, from the force of these bombs. And while she was loading up some of these orphans, she heard another explosion, saw a flash of light, smoke go up. Tragically, what she just saw was the first airlift flight out of the country ended in a crash. 138 people were killed, including 78 of these youngsters who were set to be adopted by families abroad. It very much shook her, and this was a top 10 aviation disaster in US history at the time. But Leanne is able to load up the orphans, and this is her image. She has a picture of a C-131 jet here. And you can see the orphans are in boxes. There was 22 boxes down the center of the plane. Seats had been stripped out, and there's their safety belt, quote unquote, if you want to call it that. On the sides of the plane, the older orphans would sit, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, and they took off. Leanne, her mission lasted 10 days. She's going to fly from Saigon to the Philippines, spends a few days there, goes from the Philippines to San Francisco, Denver, and then ultimately she goes to Cedar Rapids, and she reunites with her family members, and certainly has a harrowing story. And she was asked by reporters, would you go back to Vietnam? And she said, no way, it's too dangerous. That flight out that ended in a crash, Leanne could have easily been on it. The FCVN was being punished because a pilot took off without permissions. But otherwise, she could have been on that flight that ended in a disaster. So Operation Baby Lift was not without controversy. There's a lot of political fallout from this. There's Ford snuggling on a baby. What is America doing? Are we trying to save face? Are we trying to look good? Are we trying to get good PR? Maybe this will help the US government send more forces to Vietnam, send more money to the South. Maybe we'll focus on bringing out these cute orphans instead of the pending fall of South Vietnam. Some accuse the Americans of cultural chauvinism. Were these orphans truly going to be better off in the US? Hugh Hefner of Playboy sent his own private jet to San Francisco. He picked up a load of the orphans and flew them to New York City. You can find pictures of these playmates snuggling up on these orphans. People were thinking, are they going to a decadent culture? Would they be better off in Vietnam under communism? And then the other question of, were these truly orphans arose? There was a Vietnamese volunteer who went to the Presidio in San Francisco, and she interviewed a lot of these orphans, the older ones who could talk. They said, "Where's my mommy? I have a mom." So there was debate about whether or not all these folks were orphans. Some women had sent their children to orphanages temporarily. They never meant it to be a full parting. They felt like the youngsters would be safer at the orphanage and would visit them. A class action lawsuit was filed, but it was ultimately dismissed. And if you wanted to petition for your child back as the parent, you had to locate that child and petition the court legally. Only 12 women were able to get their children back. One of them, you can see in that image, she was from Montana and discovered her young child, about 4 to 5 years old, had been adopted by a couple in Iowa from Forest City. Bonnie and Johnny Nelson adopted Ben, had him for about a year, and the mother came back. There was a contentious court case, and the justices ultimately ruled on behalf of the mother, biological mother, and the Nelsons had their orphans stripped from them. And obviously, that was an agonizing experience. All told, about 2,000 of these orphans made it to the US. Others went to Canada. It wasn't just the US, but about 2,000 came. Marines were still in Vietnam after 1973. So during that 2 years, there were Marines posted there to guard the embassy and look after matters. And some of them had the very unenviable task of bagging those orphans' bodies after that tragic crash. That brings us to our next Iowan, Darwin Judge. So he's from Marshalltown, Iowa, an Eagle Scout, likes motorcycles, woodworking, made a grandfather clock for his family, works at Clifton grocery store in town. He's very devout. He's a very devout Christian, and this really explains his hatred of communism. It was godless. He felt like he had to be over there to prevent communism from coming here, from spreading. So he's a young man, only 18, and he's really pumped to join the Coast Guard. He goes to enlist. Coast Guard's not open. The Marines were, and he ends up in the Marines. His dad was a World War II vet, had flown in a B 17 as a tail gunner, so there's a legacy of service in the family. His mom was active as an American Legion auxiliary, helped with the Veterans Hospital out there in Marshalltown. But Judge did well in his training, was chosen to be a Marine security guard. You had to be pretty sharp to do that. So these Marine security guards, there were about 60 some of them who are in Saigon, and that's where Judge goes in early March. He's just over 5 foot tall. He's called a snuffy. He's a newbie. Some joked and thought he looked like Opie from the classic TV show. But while he's over there, he stays in the Marine house in Saigon. They have some wild stories of what went on in that place, you could imagine. But something stuck with Judge. It was a middle-aged gentleman who walked in and he slams $3,000 on the table. And he says, "This goes to the first Marine who marries my daughter." To be willing to marry your daughter off to a complete stranger just kind of showed the desperation of the people at this time. So Judge he's in Saigon and he's serving as protection for U.S. Ambassador to Vietnam, Graham Martin. So he's doing security detail, trying to keep Ambassador Martin safe. And something fateful happens. So there's about 60 submarines. About 15 are sent to the DAO. This is the Defense Attaché Office. It's called Dodge City by the Marines, but it's outside of where the embassy is. It's across town. Another 46 stay at the embassy. So the Marines get split. And amongst those sent to the DAO are Darwin Judge and a guy named Charles McMahon. He'd been in Vietnam for just days. So Judge was ordered to be at the DAO and to help with getting some refugees out. You can see them on the right-hand side. 4:29, April 29th, very early in the morning, there was an explosion. It woke a Marine up named Maloney, and he goes to investigate. And he sees there's a plane at Tan Son Nhut Air Base, which is right next to the DAO, and there's soldiers jumping out. It's on fire. It's maybe going to explode. And then he's looking, where's Judge? and McMahon. And as he's running to their post, to the guard tower, he sees a boot and then a torso without arms. Charles McMahon had been shot by a rocket. Maloney then hears some gunfire and he takes cover. He thinks he's being shot at, but these are rounds that are going off during a fire. Motorcycles had been caught in this explosion and blown up. So Maloney runs over and he sees a person there. It's Judge. He grabs him by the collar and pulls him out, and his hand is burned. Judge had been killed in action by that same explosion that killed McMahon. And people found out about this rather quickly. There were sobs on Dragnet. This was the Marine radio. Oh man, Judge. They got Judge. I went to Marine security guard school with the guy. Oh man. So Judge was killed in action in the early hours on 4/29. 869 Iowans lost their lives in Vietnam. 58,151 American deaths occurred. And Judge was one of the last combat deaths on the ground in Vietnam. Henry was a postal worker, that's Judge's father, and he was pulled over by Marines who gave him the news that his son had been killed in action. And then he had to break the news to his wife, Ida, who we see pictured. Judge's big sister was also pregnant at the time. And in his last telegram, Judge wrote, I thought I would let you know that I'm doing fine and nothing to worry about. I love you, your son, Darwin. With Judge's death, Ambassador Martin tried to block the release. He didn't want people to know that Judge and McMahon had died, those two Marines, with this rocket attack at Tan Son Nhut Air Base. The Marines overrode him and the information goes out. President Ford discovered their deaths and he ordered a meeting of the National Security Council immediately. And basically, you had three options to get people out of Vietnam. You could use the Saigon River and try a sea evac. Well, that was out. Fixed winged aircraft out of Tan Son Nhut Air Base, take the big Galaxies, the other big jets. Well, this was out. If one of those rockets that had killed Judge hits an aircraft, you got hundreds of people who will perish. It's too dangerous. So now you're down to your last option. This is a helicopter evacuation of Saigon. And that's what happens on April 29th through April 30th, 1975. The temperature in Saigon is 105 degrees and rising. I'm dreaming of a white Christmas, just like the ones I used to know. Bing Crosby song played after that message, and it played on repeat, White Christmas, over and over again. That was code. Operation Frequent Wind had begun. The Americans were getting out. And that's going to take us to the next Iowan I want to profile. So we got pilot Jerry Berry. His background, well, his family's from Montana. His dad lost work. He just gets in a car and he drives east. And he gets to Des Moines, Iowa. And that's where the family settles. Barry attends Des Moines Technical High School. He's a standout athlete, all city and hoops, very good at football. You can see the bottom picture. He gets to play football, starting QB at Simpson College. 1968, he knows he's about to go into the military and he doesn't want to be humping the boonies. He wants to fly. He sees a picture of a cool aircraft, asks, hey, can I do that to the recruiter of the Marines? And he tries it out, gets accepted into flight school. He's kind of odd in that he is the first Marine to ever attend Army flight school. The Army was very desperate to get some folks trained. So he goes in, he trains very quickly. And in 1969, he goes to Vietnam. He's in country Vietnam and he's flying helicopters, CH-46s, Hueys, and his mission is extraction and insertion. I'll start with a light mission, an easy one here. Barry was assigned to pick up a bunch of nurses and have them party with the soldiers at base. So these nurses are there, they're dancing, having a good time with the soldiers. It's a great time. And It's getting late. So Barry asks his commander, hey, I guess I should be taking the ladies home. And his commander says, are you kidding me? You can't go in this weather. And he points to the sky. There wasn't a cloud up there. The weather was perfectly fine. So the nurses ended up staying all night, and Barry flew them home in the morning. Another mission that's a little more intense. This is the Ashaw Valley mission. So this is in 1969, and the Ashaw Valley is very mountainous. There's a recon team that's pinned down there. They got to get out, but they've been stuck because of bad weather. Barry can't fly in and get them out. But now the enemy has engaged them. They're shooting at them. And if they don't get them out, they're going to perish or at the least be captured. So Barry's trying to fly in, and there's this dense cloud layer, 100, 150 feet. So Barry says to the guys on the ground, shoot a star cluster in the sky. That's basically a flare on steroids. I'll have a general idea where you are, and I'm going to come down through the clouds. When I do that, pop the yellow smoke. I'll see you, pick you up. We'll be good to go. So Barry sees the star cluster, and he's flying blind through these clouds. Could easily smash into a mountainside, could smash into the ground for all he knew. But he makes it down. He still has maybe 200 feet altitude before the ground, and he sees the yellow smoke pot. He thinks, man, I am good at my job. And then he starts taking all this fire. The enemy sees him. He's a sitting duck. He's going to perish. Those guys on the ground are going to get killed. This is a total disaster. When all of a sudden there's all the supporting fire behind Barry. The pilot flying a Cobra attack helicopter just unloaded on the enemy forces. And this saved Barry, and it saved that team on the ground. They jump into Barry's helicopter and they get out of there. The person who flew that Cobra attack helicopter is named Doug Simmons. He went to Lincoln High School, had played Barry in basketball, attended Simpson College. I just thought that was a powerful story of two Iowans heroically serving their country. Now, Barry transitions to jets. He left Vietnam on his way back to Des Moines. He's in his GTO speeding, gets in a speed trap just south of town, but the cops find out he's a Marine and they wait, well, we got a Marine here, and they let him go, write everybody else up. But he stayed in the service, gets into jets, and his commander in Japan, he's in Okinawa, he says, hey, there's going to be an evac of Saigon coming up. You flew helicopters. Do you went back in? And Barry's like, oh, I would like to attend that. So he goes back to Vietnam in 75, and he's participating in Operation Frequent Wind. And he has a mission within a mission. His mission is called Embassy. He's charged with picking up the ambassador from the embassy and safely taking them to a ship off the 7th Fleet called the Blue Ridge. So Barry's flying, he goes to the embassy, he says, I'm here for the ambassador. Marines say, oh, the ambassador's not ready. Okay, so Barry picks up a bunch of people and he leaves. That's him actually during this mission, flying a Sea Knight helicopter. You could put about 25 combat soldiers all loaded up with their gear, but as he's flying, there's 70, 75, 80 people packing into his helicopter trying to get out of Vietnam. He's taking refugees, third country nationals, Americans. And anyhow, he's just flying over and over and over again. And he keeps asking, I'm here for the ambassador. Well, the ambassador's not ready. This continues hours, hours, and hours. And at one point, Barry looks out and he sees just him and his wingman. Now he's getting mad. He calls up dispatch and says, hey, I need confirmation. We're the only two guys out flying right now. Dispatch is like, yeah, we shut everybody else to a crew rest. Barry's furious. He started flying as soon as everyone else did, and he's been flying longer than anyone else. So he goes to the embassy and he lands. It's very early in the morning. And he writes with a little pencil on a piece of paper, ambassador will depart with me now. And he gives that to somebody and he says, the president sends. The president didn't send, but he just made it sound like the president had commanded the ambassador to get on. And hey, sure enough, just a few minutes later, who pops out? It's Graham Martin, the ambassador. He gets into Barry's helicopter, and Barry says, "Tiger, tiger, tiger." The tiger is out of his cage. That was code for the ambassador had been picked up. Unfortunately, there was a miscommunication. Barry lands, drops the ambassador off at the US Blue Ridge, and people thought that the tiger is out of his cage meant the entire embassy had been evacuated. That wasn't the case. There were still about 60 some Marines there, the Marine security detail. So Barry has to go back to the embassy. He's able to get about 50 of these guys in his helicopter, and he takes off. There's still about a dozen left. There's refugees, several hundred of them plus. And they're trying to push through the gates to break through. They know this is their last chance. If all these Marines are gone, they're not going to come back for us. So they're trying to break through. The soldiers are using gas to try to keep them at bay. And then the last helicopter picks up those last 12 guys and they go off to the 7th Fleet, and then they're on their way. Barry flew 18.3 hours during Operation Frequent Wind, more than anybody else. He was nervous he was going to get in trouble because he was well over flight hours, but a higher up said, if anybody is shutting down while Marines are on the ground, if you're shutting down helicopters, I will personally court-martial you. So he was vindicated. He knew he would not be in any sort of trouble. This was the largest helicopter evacuation in history. 71 helicopters brought out 7,800 people. And certainly Barry brought out many of those. Tragically, during the evacuation, during this chaos, the bodies of Charles McMahon and Darwin Judge were left behind. Senator Kennedy of Massachusetts had to do a lot of negotiating to get those bodies returned to the States. By that time, a new group had arrived in Iowa, the Tai Dam. So who are the Tai Dam? Well, their ethnic background, Tai Dam means black Thai. So they're like the Thai from Thailand. They share similarities to Lao from Laos as well. What sets them apart is their religious background. They reject Buddhism traditionally, and they believe there are spirits in our body. And when we die, some spirits ascend into heaven and others remain on an altar. And they worship those spirits on an ancestral altar, those that remain behind. They have their own script, speak similar language to the Lao of Laos. In their origin story, their creation story, two lords fell from the sky, the Lokam and Luang. These Lokam or Bakam, if you heard that name, they're to be the political leaders of the Tai Dam, and the Luang are to be the priests. In terms of scholarship, not much is known about the Tai Dam. Very understudied group. And again, Tai Dam means black tie, and you can see that comes from the attire worn especially by the females. So, the Tai Dam, originally they're from Northwest Vietnam, the Dien Bien Phu area. And they are allies with the French. They fight the communists. They hate the communists. Those who came to Iowa despise communism. Well, the French fall. It's going to be communist in the north. What happens is the Tai Dam flee to Laos. And from there, they rebuild their lives. But they can see what happened in Saigon. They know that South Vietnam has fallen. And they just got an inkling Laos is going to be next. It's only a matter of time. The communists kept receipts on what we had done in Northwest Vietnam. Some of them had joined the Royal Lao Army, fought against communism in Laos. They knew that their lives were going to be jeopardized if they remained in Laos and it fell to communism. So they escaped to the Nong Khai refugee camp in Thailand. And it's from there they write letters to 30 US governors. They send delegates to France. They're trying to find asylum, and nobody agreed except for Robert Ray of Iowa. So, what a refugee? This is somebody who faces persecution, but the definition was narrower in 1975. America practiced calculated kindness. You had to be fleeing communism. If the right-wing government was persecuting you, the US didn't care. It was kind of tough luck. So the Tai Dam had the anti-communist credentials to come to America, but there were issues to Ray bringing them. Laos had yet to fall to communism, so what the Thai Dom had to do was go back to their Vietnamese roots to be accepted as Vietnamese and come under the Vietnamese quota. Another issue was the dispersal policy. Miami-Dade, Florida had been overran. Dade County, Miami, Florida, overran by Cubans, really overwhelmed the social services. It caused tensions between locals and newcomers. So the State Department had this policy where they were going to kind of sprinkle refugees across the US. The Thai Dom wanted to come as a group and to go to one state. So that's Ray with Ford, and he goes to meet Ford and Henry Kissinger and gets an exemption to bring the Thai Dom to Iowa. Now, why did Ray help? Certainly, Christian ethics played a role. Ray felt like Christian love was universal, it didn't stop at national borders. Another issue is he's pals with Ford. That's his guy. He knew Ford through coming up as vice president, hanging out in the state of Iowa, political campaigns. And Ford's nice. He listens to governors. It's good to get. He's easy to get along with. He wasn't as dismissive of governors as say Nixon was. And then Ray just felt like it was his duty. Iowa had a duty. We had to be a team player and pick up the pieces from the Vietnam War. We have to do our part and help these refugees who were our allies. And then another reason Ray wanted to help, he wanted control over the process. Refugees were coming to Iowa no matter what. So if Ray creates his own refugee program, he has greater control over it. So he has something called the Governor's Task Force, and this eventually becomes the Iowa Refugee Service Center, and it's unique. Only the state of Iowa directly resettled refugees. Everywhere else, it was done through private groups like the Catholic or Lutheran Church. So that was an Iowa anomaly. The state directly resettled refugees. The philosophy of this program was work first. Ray was going to put these refugees to work. He despised that refugees would come to the US and go to welfare immediately. He felt like to be an Iowan, you needed to work. There were issues that arose. So some early problems. Well, maybe Ray took things overboard with his refugee program. That woman you can see pictured is named Colleen Shearer. She ran Job Service of Iowa, and she was going to use the Job Service of Iowa locations to get refugees jobs. And they also had sponsors who were charged with getting refugees jobs. And if refugees went on welfare, they were to alert the state. That's Hung Bakam. He worked at the refugee program as well. Well, the problem that arose is a federal report said Iowa was rejecting refugees who qualified for welfare. They were breaking the rules. The other issue that emerged is the state said the Thai Dom were great to work with. The Vietnamese were more difficult. They wanted to go on welfare. They didn't want to work as hard. They've been more difficult to work with. And the Catholic Church predominantly worked with the Vietnamese. And they took issue with this new state resettlement program. So there was some sparring back and forth. But all told, the Iowa Refugee Service Center, it matured into a very well-respected program. West Germany sent delegates to learn about Iowa's program. Australia copied the volunteer tutor program that Iowa had. And it did a very good job. It repaired its relationship with the Catholic Church. Now, there were some problems for the Thai Dom as they tried to transition to life in Iowa. Certainly weather. They were not used to cold. One guy was trying to shovel snow off his rooftop. He had to learn how to drive in frigid weather. There was also the issue of patriarchy. So the Thai Dom leaders are all male. Certainly the US has got some patriarchy, but it's a little stronger. And they had to report to a woman. Colleen Shearer was in charge of the Iowa Refugee Service Center on Ray's behalf. Another problem, the Thai Dom didn't understand the full range of diversity in America. Some of them didn't even know African Americans existed. And they had to resettle in some of the cheaper neighborhoods in Des Moines, and a lot of their neighbors were going to be African Americans. The Thai Dom also had a lot of human capital, a lot of things going for them. The first 130,000 refugees who came to the US, 1975, 1976, a lot of them were professionals, and the Thai Dom fits that bill. So they were officers in the military. They might have spoken not only Tai Dam language and Lao language, but Vietnamese, French. Some of them had some English language skills. Had very good leaders. You can see some of them left to right. You have Wing Kam, Hung Bakam. The other gentleman is named Somsak Thongpet. That's Thomas Munoz. And then the last guy is Faluang Bakam. And the two guys on the left and the one on the right are Tai Dam. And they played important roles in the refugee resettlement of their peers. There was great success with Iowa's refugee program and with the Tai Dam. In just 5.5, 6 years, they average about 2 vehicles per household. 80% became homeowners. So the refugee program was maybe going to be temporary at first, but it continues. And this allows Ray and the state to take action during another crisis. The boat people. Causes: communism was gaining stronger hold over South Vietnam by the late 1970s. People who had worked with the Americans, they were soldiers who served with the United States as allies. They were involved in the South Vietnamese government. They were police officers. They were business folks. Any connection to the USA, and you went to quote unquote re-education camp. Here there was indoctrination, torture, starvation, sometimes death. And then if you survive, you lived a marginalized life. You could go back at any time. You had trouble getting employment. You were stigmatized. So America's allies just wanted to get out of Vietnam. You also had tensions with China. The Vietnamese have a long history of struggle with the Chinese, and border warfare had emerged. People did not want to send their sons to go fight for the communist government. They wanted to avoid the draft. A lot of people, particularly ethnic Chinese who had backgrounds in business, wanted to leave Vietnam as the communists were gaining influence. So a lot of these folks, they took to the seas in these rickety vessels that aren't even seaworthy half the time. Well, in January 1979, Ray went to a Drake basketball game. He was an avid fan, and he comes back and he watches a 60 Minutes program by Ed Bradley showing the plight of the boat people who would reach landfall and be towed back out to sea. People were dying of drowning, thirst, disease, murder. Rape on the high seas was commonplace. About 1 in 3 boat people are believed to have died. We're talking about 250,000 plus people. So just unbelievable. 60 Minutes episode really spoke to Ray. And he's working with a guy named Kenneth Quinn, who's a State Department official. He's on loan from the State Department to the state of Iowa, starts helping out with refugee programs. And anyhow, Ray comes up with his response. His response is, the state of Iowa is going to double the number of refugees it had intended to admit. He wrote letters to President Carter and all the other governors asking them to do more. He and Quinn will be part of a delegation that goes to Geneva, and they announced the U.S. is going to double the number of refugees brought. The picture here is called The Boat of No Smiles. Eddie Adams did some photography showing the tragic story of the boat people, and he'd been all over the world, and the boat people were the only ones where he could not even get the children to smile. This was very controversial. To say I was going to continue accepting refugees. There were people who supported. They were often churchgoers, do-gooders. Some really supported this because Ray is their guy. They like him. He's got an approval rating somewhere near like 80% during Vietnam. There's also guilt about the destructive role America played overseas, and helping refugees was kind of a way to ease that guilt for some. There were also problems. Black Americans, African Americans felt like their favoritism was being shown to refugees. The state was really working to get them jobs. Well, what about us? We've been here for forever. Some of us came here as slaves and our ancestors. So why are we helping out these foreigners and not our African American population? And then you can see that quote there. A lot of people were against this because of blunt racism. They wrote Ray and were very blunt in their comments. They did not want Iowa to be overran by a yellow peril. Common complaint was they're going to steal jobs. Ray was ready when one person called in to complain. He had staffers count the number of jobs listed in the Des Moines Register, 1,029. He told that person, look, you got everything right in front of you. You go out and get one of those jobs before these refugees come here and take it. The Vietnam War was just so controversial and people wanted to be done. America had pulled out in 73, and here we are still dealing with this issue. It's just an old wound that wouldn't go away. One service member, a Vietnam veteran, returned his flag to the governor's office. He was just so disappointed that the state was continuing to help refugees who he and others saw as bad allies. They had lost the war, not the US. They were bad allies. So, anyhow, Ray continues to work with the Thai Dom, and he and a small group, his wife, Billy, a small group of governors, Kenneth Quinn, they travel to the Far East and they go to the Nong Khai refugee camp in Thailand. And it's there that delegates say, we are a symbol of hope. And they take the delegation to this thatched little hut, and on the wall inside is the Iowa Department of Transportation map with pins pushed through where Thai Dom families had resettled. Well, the Iowa delegation was moved to tears, and they promised that they would bring these folks to Iowa and reunite them with loved ones and friends. The delegation continued. It was decided that they're going to check out a refugee camp in Thailand for Cambodians. So Ray and company go there, and what they saw haunted them. 50 people a day were dying at this camp. These were victims of the Khmer Rouge, the communists who had torn through Cambodia. Nearly 3 million people were killed at their hands. One guy talked about slitting throats so many times he developed arthritis in his forearm. He had to change up his execution method and plunge the knife directly into the throat. S-21 is a prison camp where people were tortured and killed. Thousands went through, only 12 survived. Khmer Rouge soldiers drank people's gallbladders, put plastic bags over their head, suffocated their victim. Anyhow, Cambodia goes to war with Vietnam. The Vietnamese communists invade, and this creates the avenue for some of them to escape and to go to Sakeo and elsewhere. And the US uses this as a pretext to start helping Cambodians. Governor A comes back from this trip and he's devastated, and he launches something called Iowa Shares. This sends help to aid refugees and end starvation. What Iowa Shares is going to do is it's going to have people send money to the governor's office. You'll buy a share of humanity, which is the cost of a bushel of corn. And they're going to use these funds to send food, medicine, doctors, nurses from Iowa to the refugees in Thailand. This was certainly controversial. A lot of people were saying, what are we doing? We have poverty in Iowa. We need to help out our rural poor. Some stories of poverty at the time. A woman who ate dog food for a year to save money so she could pay her funerary expenses. A guy who lived on a pig feed lot in a shed. But to those who said, we don't need to help these foreigners, we need to help Iowans, Ray had a powerful quote. He said, if we don't have the heart or the spirit to save human lives, then how can we be expected to help those whose lives are already assured? If we turn our back while people are dying, we're not going to even help those at home. Iowans can do both. A lot of people were motivated by Pope John Paul II's recent visit to Living History Farms. The Pope told Iowans, the stewards of the land, we have a responsibility to share our bounty with the hungry. It was very ecumenical. The Des Moines Register helped with some free advertising. They had pictures posted that Governor Ray had taken of Cambodians suffering, like the image you see to your left. All told, Iowa Shares raised $540,000 over the 1979-1980 holiday season. One woman sent her wedding ring. Kenneth Quinn had to send it back. A 9-year-old boy sent his Christmas money. The Cambodians deserve a Christmas too, he said. So, kind of a legacy of what I've discussed with you today, 50 years after the fall of Saigon. I think there's a lot of state pride. This is a very dark time in human history. And Iowans, they did some very wonderful work. They were bright spots in this very dark time. Darwin Judge, he died serving his country. A lot of people wrote letters to his mom and dad, and maybe they even meant well, but they would say, "What a waste." He died at this end of this war, right at the end, and it's just a waste. But his parents hated that. Their son had not died in vain. He died serving his country, protecting refugees, protecting fellow service members. One story is from a guy named Potratz, a fellow Marine, and he was having trouble getting his Vietnamese bride and his stepdaughter out of the DAO. They might not get out. His family might fall apart. What would happen to his wife? What would happen to his kid? Who does he see? Judge. He says, "What do you need, Sarge?" And he tells him the story. And Judge goes and gets the paperwork really quickly, comes back and says, "Hey, your wife and daughter are on the next flight out." And Potratz has a lasting memory of Judge carrying his daughter piggyback style with 2 bags of luggage in each hand. And of course, Judge was lost shortly after that. But his parents recognized there was value in helping refugees gain a better life, a life of freedom in America. Leanne Thyman, I don't have her image here, but in the earlier slide, if you look at the Presidio when she arrived in San Francisco, she was on the list to adopt. Well, officials said, you can go in and pick a orphan of your choosing. They don't have any parents assigned. How do you make that choice? But she walks in, this little 9-month-old boy crawls up her leg and her arms, and she adopts this child, names him Mitch, made her family whole. At the bottom, you can see an image of Governor Ray and his wife Billy at the 2013 dedication of the Thai village. This was a replica village built in Des Moines by the Thai Dom. If you follow MLK North until it ends, off to the right is this Thai village. They named their welcome center after Robert D. Ray, their lion, their hero. You can see the powerful quote here by Samba Khan. Ray's health was failing by 2015, and Samba Khan, a refugee Governor Ray brought here in 1975, ends up being one of his nurse caregivers who would help, clean him up, shave him. It was a way to pay it back. The guy who'd done so much for her family, for her people. Bottom right, that's Jerry Berry. He continued his long career in the U.S. service. He's a commanding officer at a training center when a young Marine comes in and says, "Hey, I'm Quang Phong, and I was a 9-year-old boy, and you brought me out of Vietnam." So just 9 years later, he learned English. He gets to go to school at a very prestigious institution in Los Angeles, joins the Marines, and he ends up flying in the same squadron as Barry, the same squadron that brought him out of Vietnam. The two remain close to this very day. Barry attended his wedding in the Jacksonville area. They still talk. Top right, maybe this is the most powerful story of powerful bonds formed between Iowans and refugees. On the left, we have Jeffrey Newland. This is Governor Ray's grandson. And on the right is Jasmine Vong. The two married. Jasmine is the daughter of Thai Dom refugees. Her mother came here as a young child as a Thai Dom refugee and became a school teacher in the Des Moines public school system. The two welcomed a new son named Liam. His birthday, April 30th, the same day Saigon fell. On the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, young Liam will turn 1 year old. These powerful bonds are pretty commonplace. I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My first friend in Iowa from a Vietnamese family whose father fought against the communism in South Vietnam. I'm giving this presentation from my house in my home office. My house was built by a Bosnian child refugee. My good friend and coworker recently retired. She's a survivor of the killing fields in Cambodia. I teach at DMAC. I have students who are the children and grandchildren of refugees. Some of them are refugees themselves from places like South Sudan, Iraq, Afghanistan, and they've enriched the learning environment. The stories of these Iowans are so compelling, so inspiring, but even more so the refugees who had to overcome such trauma and carve out a better life for themselves. And the reason why I share these powerful bonds, and I'm going to leave this as my parting shot. When we close the door on refugees, it is not only the refugees who lose out. That concludes my presentation, and now we're going to open it up for any questions.
Thank you, Matt. That was fantastic. We do have some time to answer some questions. As a reminder to our attendees, if you do have questions, please submit those through the Q&A feature, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. For starters here, Matt, I'm really curious about what sparked your interest in Governor Ray and refugee resettlement in Iowa.
Well, I came here, like I said, from Pittsburgh, and I was amazed at the diversity. I thought I was coming to a bunch of, cornfields, and everybody I would teach would be from Scandinavia or Germany, have that kind of background. And the urban campus where I worked was so diverse, and I kind of discovered this ties to refugees. My coworker at the time, she was the provost at the urban campus, had worked in a Cambodian refugee camp. She's like, hey, you're doing some studies here for your dissertation. You might want to check this Robert Ray and refugee story out. And I watched a very powerful documentary, A Promise Called Iowa. It was very moving. And I just really, really wanted to learn more. My coworker is the governor's daughter, Randy Ray. So that was also another neat connection. But yeah, it was just a compelling story, and I was amazed at the uniqueness of it all.
We have a question here from one of our viewers. Early on in your presentation, you talked about that initial plane out of for Operation Baby Lift crashed, and they were curious what was the cause of the crash of that first plane.
That's a good question. It wasn't struck by the enemy. It was a mechanical failure. So like a cargo hold, I believe like the hydraulic cargo hold was inoperable, and it fell off, and this busted up the plane. And then they lost pressurization. So people on board talked about the orphans getting dopey was their term. They got really, really quiet. And it's because of a lack of oxygen. They weren't able to have little masks that fell down and use those for oxygen. But the crash it wasn't the enemy that struck, it was a mechanical failure.
Thanks for that answer. Yeah, that was, they were wondering mechanical or enemy fire. So thanks for clarifying. Another question coming through in our questions here. Do you know what Iowa's contribution was like in the war? How many Iowans died in Vietnam, or how many Iowans fought there?
I don't have the exact number of how many fought there, but I did give the number earlier. It's about 869 Iowans are believed to have died in the war, and Judge would have been the last one, obviously. Now, Judge and McMahon, they are killed in action. They're the last to die on the ground. There was a crash of an aircraft later on, and two service members died there. So I don't think we can say that they were the last two to die in the war, Judge and McMahon, but we can definitely say they were the last two to die on the ground. And then the bodies did not come until March of 1976. As I said, Senator Kennedy had to do a lot of negotiating to get them. They were left at the Seventh-day Adventist Hospital. But yeah, 869 is the number that I have.
You mentioned some stories of Iowans, and I was particularly compelled by your storytelling. It was really well done. So I'm curious, when you're trying to construct a narrative like this and kind of piece things together, where do you go to dig up your sources? And did you, over the course of your research, find any really sources that stood out or struck you as interesting?
Yeah, I say just for starters, that IPTV documentary, A Promise Called Iowa, that was a really cool starting point. And then I asked Governor Ray's representatives if I could have access to the Ray papers. They hadn't been completed yet, so I started pouring through your archives at the State Historical Society in Des Moines. And the Ray papers had a bunch of boxes on refugee resettlement. Not a lot of it connected to Ray and the Tai Dom, though. There was minimal sources on that. And I think that was kind of intentional because if this thing went sideways, they really wanted Shearer to fall on the sword, Colleen Shearer or somebody else. So they were trying to protect Ray politically. So the Ray papers would be very important if somebody's trying to study this topic. And then I think I have a little bibliography that I was asked for, but Leanne Thyman and Carol Day, her original name was Helder, but she goes by Carol Day as the author. This Must Be My Brother is a book about the two Iowans going on that powerful mission, the orphan lift, and getting those youngsters out. And if you're interested in the Marines, Last Men Out is a pretty compelling read, and it talks about the evacuation of Saigon and focuses a little bit on Barry and Judge.
Yeah, thanks for sharing those resources. We'll be sure that when we post this on YouTube, we'll include those in our some links to those items so that people can go out and look for some research of their own if they are so interested.
Yeah,
So
and Barry,
yeah, go ahead.
Barry also, I did an oral history interview with him, and I'm finishing up the transcriptions there. But you could probably look up some stuff. Barry's story. He spoke about taking out the ambassador on public television and other media outlets. So there's a lot of good information you can get on him.
Yeah, and the availability of oral histories seem especially compelling. We're in the middle of our National History Day competitions here, traveling around the state of Iowa, and it's always interesting when students can find, in their own words and in their own voices, people sharing and recounting their stories. So as we wrap up here, I'm curious, do you have any further research that you hope to dig into? Any rabbit holes related to the topic that you plan to go down in the future?
Well, the Iowa History Journal asked me to write an article for the 50th anniversary, and that'll be coming out in their May issue. So there's that. And I've thought of maybe trying to do some work on Bosnian refugees in Iowa. Not a lot of work has been completed on them, and certainly there was a genocide that unfolded there, and it's not very well documented. And I think there's some powerful stories that could be dug up.
Sounds like exciting research for a future 101 webinar. So with that, we're going to bring this webinar to a close. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And we'd like to extend one last thank you to our presenter, Matt. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the second and fourth Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories to tell in the upcoming months. For more information and to register for future webinars in this series or to watch recordings, check out our website at history.iowa.gov. Looking to learn more Iowa history? You can find and watch over 90 recorded webinars of past 101 programs on the Iowa Culture YouTube channel. We look forward to virtually seeing you for the next special Iowa History 101 webinar on March 27th. The topic will be Iowa's first Japanese garden. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.